Hi, I'm April Pride, founder of Setset and host of Setset Show, where we dive into the world of psychedelics for women, mostly. Today I'm thrilled to introduce Clare Sausen, the talented writer behind High Design, a Substack where she explores the intersection of cannabis and the cool products that enhance our sessions with the plant, inspiring us to rethink our spaces and experiences. In this first part of our two-part interview, Claire and I discuss how thoughtful design can elevate the psychedelic and cannabis experience, whether it's through carefully crafted accessories or a card game created to enhance connection and exploration during altered states. Special for our listeners through Black Friday. When you go to our website, that's getsetset.com, GETSETSET.com, enter the number 3, FOR, the number 2, at checkout and receive 1 deck of cards for free when you buy 2 decks of cards. That's 3 FOR 2 at getsetset.com. If you're passionate about design, cannabis, and psychedelics, or simply curious about how these worlds collide, keep listening as we explore high design with Clare Sausen. Hey, Claire.
Hi, April.
How are you today?
I'm doing well.
Cool. It's nice to see your face and
Yes,
to
it's so
meet
nice
you.
to meet you. Thank you so much for reaching out.
I love what you do. You have the best job in the
Thank
world.
you. Thank you.
I just want to let you know that it starts recording as soon as we are
Okay,
on so that I don't
perfect.
forget to do that.
Where are you located? Oh,
I'm in Seattle.
okay. I'm
Seattle.
in LA.
Got it. I've got all the gear and everything based on my spontaneous tears over the last 10 days. I think it's starting to wear on me.
Right.
But why
Can
am I
tell at a
crying
certain point.
again?
Yeah. Honestly, there's only so much you can do.
I know. I'm like, really? Is this the time of year to not smoke weed? It's not a good idea.
Oh, the dry of it all.
Yeah, exactly. I allow myself 3 times a week. I have to put permission
Okay.
because it just has to be that way, unfortunately.
I always think that's smarter. Trying to dive into anything cold turkey immediately is always such a shock to the system that I find it a lot easier to gradually just be mindful and taper off. And sometimes it comes by itself along with you feeling better and being more in the moment.
I just think I found cannabis when I stopped drinking. And
Okay.
my ex-husband was like, "Do you really think you're going to go your whole life sober?" I was like, "Sucks. So I hope not." And then I had already consumed cannabis, but I never had my own stash. And then it was legal here in Washington State. I was so grateful for cannabis. And then I was like, no, now I'm doing this all the time. Great. Okay.
Right.
So
I know it
think
can happen
just,
that way.
yeah, it is definitely my drug of choice.
And it's certainly harm reduction, but I know what you mean. You can still feel that part of your mind that's like, am I always doing this mindfully or is it just to escape from reality sometimes?
Yeah. And it just, if I haven't done it in the last 10 days and I'm having serious mental health, not so happy, it does help so much with anxiety and depression.
Yeah.
Just not,
For me.
I don't have clinical anything, but I just do, whether it's seasonal, acute, situational, functional. There's all these words that you can put in front of anxiety and depression and check.
Totally.
Yeah. I always like to start the episodes with you introducing yourself and how you did end up with the best job in the world.
So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So my kind of first job in cannabis was an internship with NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. So I went to college in DC and I stayed there for about 4 years afterwards. The internship was while I was only a sophomore. I was unpaid. It was 1 semester. It really took me down financially, honestly, but it was worth it in terms of exposure to the industry. And it really was such an amazing foot in the door into what I'm doing now. I got the chance to publish an article in High Times while I was there. I was managing their blog. I was able to go to congressional sessions and hear from medical patients lobbying for bills and all of that kind of stuff, which was a really cool introduction to the industry and a really different side than what I'm doing now, but has definitely informed my track a whole lot. I graduated. I had a couple other, mostly communications based jobs. That was my major. And I ended up just really off chance working for a global architecture firm right out of school. It was a LinkedIn find that I just got lucky and was messaging with the hiring manager and came in for a few interviews and it worked out. And I really enjoyed it there. I was there for 3 years. So that was pretty much the entire time that I was in DC post grad. And I was really thrown right into it. I learned everything there was to know about pretty much everything we did because I was handling the internal copy, the external copy. I was ghostwriting for architects, which was one of my favorite things to do. It's how I got published in some interesting trade magazines in the architecture world because I was just using the voice of our spokespeople of the firm and being allowed to give it my own spin. I had a lot of creative freedom there, which was really cool. And I got to tell stories of spaces in a way that felt pretty authentic. Obviously, there were some mega buildings, like there were some Nike stores and that kind of stuff where I didn't feel connected to it. But there were some really interesting projects all over the world that I got to talk to every kind of person on staff at the sites, like psychologists, all the social workers, and see all the perspectives that go into design and that go into architecture that I had never really considered before, how multidisciplinary it was. So I really enjoyed that part of it. But at the same time, had a love for cannabis. I was still really interested in writing about cannabis after my time at NORML. I saw a path for myself there, and I was in school for communications and generally wanted to be a writer in some sense, but wasn't really sure what that looked like. And honestly, wasn't sure what the freelance world looked like. When I was younger, I always thought I'll be a staff writer at a magazine or have a column somewhere, which I have been able to do in some capacities, but it just looks very different. I was still trying to freelance pitch articles about cannabis culture, about different things about laws and prohibition states. In DC especially was a really interesting case of being a super gray area where it's federally illegal, but locally non-prosecuted, basically. However, whenever there's dispensaries that pop up, they're constantly in the risk of being raided, all their stuff being taken, all their money being taken, and it just randomly happening legally at any time. I talked about that a bit in my work. I wrote about a friend who lives in Turkey and her experience with cannabis over there for Broccoli magazine around that time. And then I was looking for other jobs, basically. Still interested in the design world and the architecture world, but I knew that I wanted to follow the cannabis world more seriously. And I wanted to see what kind of positions were even available to me then, living in DC and just not really being familiar with it on a professional level. So I ended up staff writing at Where's Weed for a little bit. And I was working in-house at Sackville & Co., which is a design accessories company. So I was able to start freelancing eventually with those two under my belt. And I had some other connections that I was pitching it into the industry. So I was able to leave the architecture firm. And now I've been doing it full time for about a year. I got laid off from Where's Weed and Sackville, both just due to marketing constraints and budgeting constraints. And sure, you're familiar. Everyone in the cannabis industry is pretty familiar right now that the budgets are just super low, especially for small independent brands. However, it's still part and parcel of the business and such an integral part of how people hear about you, how they use your products. Now I've been paving my own path from there. I launched my own newsletter. It's a Substack called High Design, where now I'm writing about design in terms of cannabis accessories, especially from a woman's perspective, using pieces and reclaiming the side of cannabis that's very growy at head shop culture, where they're intimidated by a piece like a bong, or there's just like really girly, infantilizing tailored products for you, but there's no range of quality or things to look for. And especially if you're just getting into cannabis, it's a really hard leap from never having smoked anything to getting a dab rig, for example. Such a learning curve there. And I find it really interesting to explore how the elements of architecture and design, all of those multidisciplinary angles like psychology, like social studies, like history, like all of the cultural context that goes into how people make decisions and where we are societally, seeing how that draws into the cannabis world, which has always been stigmatized and put in a very tiny box, even accepted. People tend to see it in a very colorless way based on their own experience, which is totally understandable. But since it is federally illegal, people haven't been able to have the breadth of experience with cannabis that I think it takes to learn. That's where I'm at now, freelance writing for a few brands, doing copy, doing blogs and things like that, and just taking both educational angles as well as personal angles and just an interest in and love for. So that's the not super short, but there's the version of my journey.
You didn't study design then in school.
No, I studied communications and my minor was in American studies. So I loved those kinds of classes because it was gender studies, LGBT studies, Black studies, all different angles of history that I could latch onto more than war-based history and number-based history that I was just never super interested in. So I had a cultural lens to writing. And I initially went into school as a journalism major, but I went to GW, which is wonderful school and has an amazing journalism program, but it was very politically oriented at the time that I went, at least. And the focus was very much on objectivity and reporting. And that's just not my personal style of writing. So yeah, the design came in by accident, but in a way that I really enjoyed and had always been interested in from afar, but knew nothing about any of the details in terms of real architecture, real interior design, besides decorating my apartment and enjoying Architectural Digest and that kind of thing.
I think 3 years on the job with a global architecture firm and, really being charged with the messaging about all the projects and the team. It's like a crash course. I did go to architecture school and I went to
Yeah.
Carson's for grad school. You learn so much more when you're doing it.
There's certainly a lot of technical elements that I was never able to wrap my head around and didn't need to get in the weeds on, but being able to understand the basic principles of design help a lot, but you learn it as you go. I think having, for me at least, the cultural understanding and learning how people think, how they behave in space, how they react with color. So you just look at space totally differently in terms of how it makes you feel. And I think that's also an angle that aligns really well with cannabis because it's something that really centers you in the moment and anchors you to where you are. And you become, at least for me, also with psychedelics, even, you become so much more aware of your surroundings and of the vibe or the general gist of the space. And sometimes it's really unexplainable why you hate certain places. And then you think about it and it's fluorescent lighting and it's small white hallways, dentist's office or doctor's office, or like the kind of unsettling things where I was always interested in how people were trying to change how people felt in those spaces. Like I worked on some designs for an airport in Mexico City, and they measured how people felt in different parts of the airport in terms of security, ticketing. They just measured people's stress levels in a test study to figure out where they were the highest in different points in the airport. And there they infused more elements like green walls, calming colors, and found that it really did keep people's cortisol levels down just because spaces are designed with people in mind. And I think that can be applied to consumer products, and especially in this space that is quite young, just in terms of legality and how much potential there is for how big it could be. I think it's cool to be in a place where we can start to understand the cultural effects of both the stigma on cannabis, but also how cannabis has branded itself and allowed everybody's experience to determine the cultural narrative.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up about the airport because I was curious when you said you talked to psychologists on the project, right? Can you imagine like bringing a psychologist in around like building or designing a bong? I'm just like,
Right. And
yeah, the glass is so much nicer to smoke out of, but do you think a psychologist would think that it's the smartest move considering our
right.
behavior around this particular object?
You can certainly tell with products when they're designed by someone who has used the product a lot.
The product meaning weed. Yeah.
I noticed I'm a big fan of covered ashtrays personally because an open ashtray is sticky and gross and you have to change it all the time. Most are not designed that way, but when they are, you can tell there's thought involved with it, or like a debowler, someone had to be using that to think of it. I think that there's that kind of thread there. But yeah, in design, one of my more interesting projects too was a cultural center in Arizona where we consulted with a lot of local people who were there, mostly educators and also students. It was a student center primarily. So we talked about what their studies were primarily in terms of majors and integrated that into how the building worked for them and made the space
Okay.
and just catered to the real kinds of people that were there. And there was a lot of surveys done by people that are trusted sources in the community. So it's not like a big fat architecture firm coming in and planning down, displacing locals. There's so much gentrification that happens within architecture. And I always felt icky about it, but you have to find the personal angles and the life affirming angles to it, because these spaces do make a huge difference in communities where people don't have access to the information that we take so often for granted. I think that there's, at least in where I work, there was a lot of value shown in city planning and understanding all of those different cultural elements and being respectful of places we were going into, or at least having representatives who were willing to come back and report how people were feeling about it. A lot of times that ends up in selecting a different things or in modifying the design in some way that makes it less feeling plopped down in the middle of a community that they don't understand.
As soon as you said gentrification, and that's happening too much in architecture, I never thought of it this way, but there is a bit of gentrification that happens in cannabis.
For sure. And especially as white people coming in, and as someone, I'm 26, so I don't have the same legacy experience of Canada. Obviously, I don't have the same relationship with it in terms of legality. I grew up in Pennsylvania. It was obviously illegal, but it was much more, I wasn't genuinely concerned with going to jail. I know the privilege that I have, and I'm aware of the position that I hold in the industry. So yeah, I think that's something that I think about in my position as well, and try to amplify people who aren't often given a platform, which tend to be women and women of color, and especially Black women who have some of the highest consumption rates, but are shown the least in terms of representation and small businesses and all of that kind of thing. So I have really worked to find people that I just genuinely connect with in this community. And that was part of why I moved to LA, was to just be a part of the actual cannabis community in real life, because people obviously smoke weed in DC, but it's just such a different story. And it's not usually seen as such a professional angle, and you don't get to meet people who are doing different things in the industry from manufacturing to design. So you get so many perspectives on it that I think are really valuable. So I just follow what I find interesting and the people that are doing the coolest things, which are usually the people that are the least represented. Hopefully, eventually we'll see just an entirely different landscape with this kind of stuff.
I've lived in DC. I'm from Virginia, and
Oh, awesome.
I've lived in LA, not for long, and I've obviously spent a lot of time there on the West Coast for 20 years now. When did you move there?
I moved here a year and a month ago.
You need to meet my friend Rachel Hurwitz if you haven't met her yet. She works at a concentrates company.
Oh, cool.
And she used to be in Seattle. She was the head of marketing for these. I could see you two definitely hitting it off. I'll make sure that the connection there for sure. So I saw that you did a part 1 on Ashtrays recently. So tell it, like, what's that series going to look like?
So I have recently started a series called High Designer, where I have looked into mostly fashion designer brands as well as home decor designer brands going into cannabis. I think that's a space that we're seeing become much more normalized. One of the places I was looking was like Urban Outfitters. It's just become such a common market. So the first part of it was ashtrays. I found so many ashtrays. There are so many that I didn't include even. And I put a note at the bottom of it. I found this Hermes one that was made with goat skin, which I didn't know was a material that people use, frankly, but it's like a leather form. And I was like, see, I don't know if I feel like featuring that necessarily.
Let's stop on that point for just a second. Okay.
Yeah.
So
we can assume that's going to be hundreds of dollars for an ashtray, if not thousands.
Right.
And is the idea that you actually put out the cherry in the leather and it's not going to burn it? Or there's a ceramic portion?
It was a ceramic portion on top, and it was leather on the bottom. And they said it was like a non-scuff, non-flip thing.
Okay. All right.
Which just, I understand, but just in terms of animal cruelty and in terms of renewable, sustainable resources, it just seems so wildly unnecessary for an ashtray.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's really funny how many ashtrays in the designer world there. And like I did mention in the article, there's a huge connection to cigarette smoking, obviously, in fashion.
Mhm.
And I think that as time has progressed, I think that cannabis is just, as it becomes more normalized in society at large, that starts to be reflected in fashion as well. And obviously, creatives and the fashion industry have always had a soft spot for psychedelics and weed, but it also mostly has a reputation as cigarettes and cocaine. So it's interesting to see how it shifts and how those markets cross over each other, as well as reflect not the public that they're serving to, because these things are so incredibly expensive. But yeah, so next part actually is a different subset. I'm going to be talking about lighter cases. I found some really incredibly expensive lighter cases, but also some really interesting ones that range from being super simple, incredibly branded, or just the most ornate. I have one that's nearly $20,000 that I've been looking at for this piece. So it's
Two Chainz needs to put that on his show.
Exactly. Exactly. So yeah, it's a cool perspective to look at it from someone who's certainly not anywhere near in the position to be buying any of these things, but just reflecting on what it says about where we're at.
Okay, so for the lighter cases, do you prefer a functional lighter case where you can put an already rolled joint in there and it's on the go? What did you find that you were really into?
Actually, in the pandemic, I started tinkering around with pottery, and I've been making some lighter cases on the side, small scale ceramic little guys where you slip a standard bic into it and it's just a clay.
Is this a coffee table piece? It's something that's more intended to be at home?
For my cases, especially, but there are some that would be easy to bring on the go that aren't super ornate, but there are some that I do for fun that are crazy and have wine glasses and that sort of thing on them that would be difficult, like little ceramic ones, but that would be difficult to travel with. But so I found one like that where you slip a standard stick into it and it's either like a gold sleeve or, something like that. And then there's obviously the table market or the table lighter market, which includes, the likes of Edie Parker is one of the first name that comes to mind in terms of fashion and weed connection. Their table lighters have always been super appealing, yet expensive and out of realm for me. And then there's also the vintage market of table lighters and any kind of butane refillable piece. There's a lot of quirky little like chili pepper. Sackville has a really cute chili pepper lighter that you can refill with butane and that sort of thing. I prefer one that uses a standard bic just because I'm lazy, honestly, and don't always feel like refilling with lighter fluid. I think they're beautiful. But also, I'm more of a person that smokes out of glass than joint. So a table lighter is a little less practical for me because it's typically a flame that shoots straight up and you can't manipulate it as much. So there's a lot of options in the lighter case market. I find it really interesting. And then there's wearables, there's necklaces, there's purses that have lighter cases attached to them. It's becomes a fashion statement and the emblem of being a part of a community of people who smoke, whether it be cigarettes or weed. The way that you present tends to follow suit.
Yeah. Anything by way of torches for dabbing, like there's not much there, right?
And definitely really interested in it. And especially as I've learned more about it, being almost like vaping in a way, like it's lighting a solvent and a concentrate instead of burning flour. It has health benefits that you're not inhaling like carbon and that sort of, you can get into the weeds of it. I'm super interested in it, but the torch of it all does turn me off. It's scary. And so there's the whole e-rig market is interesting in that way. That kind of takes the element out of it. I have seen some, I believe it's iSpire makes a little wand that heats up the banger of the bowl that you just put on top and is infrared heat that you hold for however long and can take off. So I am seeing some developments in that realm, but I think that's a space that could use a much more user-friendly approach and needs a way to be able to bring people in more easily, which I think e-rigs are doing.
Yes.
A lot of people argue it's a really different experience, especially if you're really into dabs. I've talked to people with a lot of different perspectives on it. The lighter of it all can be what turns people off from it, especially if you're not used to smoking. It is a weird threshold to cross if you're not used to using a lighter.
Yeah, I'm so grateful that I now know. And you light corner the
Right.
hole. Do not torch the
Exactly.
sinner. Be a kind, share your weed kindly.
Thank you for joining us for today's show. I'm April, and I'll be back with the next installment of Setset Show, where we cover everything you need to have a safe, supported psychedelic experience in the wild. If you're starting to think about holiday gifts, Setset has you covered. For the stoners and psychonauts on your list, Setset's Psychedelic Cards, a card game to enhance connection and exploration during altered states. Go to getsetset.com, that's GETSETSET.com, and get 1 deck of cards for free when you purchase 2 decks. Enter the number 3, FOR, the number 2 at checkout. That's 3, FOR, 2 at getsetset.com.